Imagine dedicating your entire life to teaching others about heaven, only to die and discover you were completely wrong. This isn't fiction. It's the true story of Pastor Michael Reynolds, whose near-death experience turned his world upside down. In the next 15 minutes, you'll hear a first-hand account that questions the very foundations of religious belief. From the moment his heart stopped to his shocking return, Reynolds' journey will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. Pastor Michael Reynolds stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying the weight of conviction honed over 25 years of ministry. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden stand, a familiar anchor in a sea of attentive faces. For a quarter-century, Reynolds had been more than just a religious leader. He had become a pillar of faith in his community, a beacon of unwavering certainty in an increasingly uncertain world. As he began his sermon, the congregation leaned in, drawn by the familiar cadence of his words. Reynolds spoke of heaven with the assurance of someone describing a place he had visited countless times. His descriptions were vivid, painting a picture of golden streets and eternal peace that resonated deeply with his flock. There was no room for doubt in Reynolds' theology. Every word was delivered with the certainty of absolute truth. The pastor's influence extended far beyond the walls of his church. In the small town he called home, Reynolds was a respected figure, sought after for counsel and guidance in matters both spiritual and mundane. His word carried weight, shaping the beliefs and actions of thousands who looked to him as a direct line to divine wisdom. As Reynolds reached the crescendo of his sermon, his voice rose with passion. "My brothers and sisters," he proclaimed, "our eternal reward awaits us, a paradise beyond imagination, where we will bask in the glory of our Creator for all eternity." The congregation nodded in agreement, comforted by the familiar promise of heavenly bliss. Little did they know that this Sunday would be different. As Reynolds continued to speak, a strange sensation began to creep through his chest. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than the intensity of the moment. But as the discomfort grew, a flicker of concern crossed his face, barely noticeable to his rapt audience. Determined to finish his message, Reynolds pushed through, his words now coming in shorter bursts. "We must hold fast to our faith," he urged, his hand unconsciously moving to his chest. "For it is through unwavering belief that we—" Suddenly, the words caught in his throat. The discomfort had exploded into searing pain. The congregation watched in horror as their beloved pastor stumbled, his face contorted in agony. Reynolds' legs gave way, and he collapsed behind the pulpit, out of sight of most of the stunned worshipers. In an instant, the serene atmosphere of the church transformed into chaos. Panicked voices filled the air, calling for help and praying for divine intervention. The first responders in the congregation rushed to Reynolds' side. The once authoritative voice that had confidently described the glories of heaven now gasped for breath. Each intake a painful struggle. Outside, sirens wailed, growing louder as emergency vehicles raced towards the church. Inside, a community grappled with the sudden vulnerability of their spiritual leader. As paramedics burst through the doors, none could have imagined that this moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything Pastor Michael Reynolds had ever believed and taught about the afterlife. The human brain is said to remain active for up to 10 minutes after the heart stops beating. For Pastor Reynolds, those precious minutes would become an eternity, one that defied everything he thought he knew about death and the afterlife. As the ambulance sped through the streets, sirens blaring, the paramedics worked with frantic intensity. Their hands moved with practiced precision, attaching electrodes and preparing the defibrillator. Pastor Reynolds lay motionless on the gurney, his skin ashen and clammy. The cardiac monitor emitted a high-pitched, continuous tone, a sound that sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned emergency responders. "No pulse," one paramedic announced, her voice tense. "Beginning CPR." The rhythmic compressions began, a desperate attempt to force life back into Reynolds' still heart. Minutes ticked by, each one critical in the battle against death. The defibrillator whined as it charged, followed by the sharp command, "Clear." Reynolds' body jerked as the electric current surged through him, but the monitor remained stubbornly flat. In medical terms, Pastor Reynolds had crossed the threshold into clinical death. His heart had ceased to beat, and his lungs no longer drew breath. The absence of blood flow meant his brain was being deprived of oxygen, initiating a cascade of physiological changes. Neurons began to fire chaotically, neurotransmitters flooded synapses, and the carefully maintained balance of cellular processes started to break down. Yet, in this liminal space between life and death, something extraordinary was occurring within Reynolds' consciousness. As his physical body lay inert, subject to the frantic ministrations of the paramedics, he became aware of a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. It began as a subtle shift, a feeling of lightness that seemed to spread from his core outward. The paramedics continued their relentless efforts, unaware of the profound journey unfolding within their patient's mind. "Come on, Pastor," one muttered, sweat beading on his forehead as he continued chest compressions. "Don't give up on us now." For Reynolds, the sensation of lightness intensified. He felt as though he were rising, separating from the very body that had defined his earthly existence. The pain that had gripped his chest moments ago faded into a distant memory. In its place came a sense of profound peace and clarity. As the ambulance raced towards the hospital, its occupants locked in a desperate struggle to revive him, Pastor Reynolds found himself crossing a different kind of threshold. The familiar confines of the physical world seemed to fall away, replaced by something vast and luminous. He was no longer aware of the ambulance, the paramedics, or even his own body. Instead, he found himself in a realm that defied description, a place that would challenge every sermon he had ever preached about the nature of the afterlife. As Pastor Reynolds drifted into this luminous realm, he expected to see the pearly gates and golden streets he'd preached about for decades. But what materialized before him was so alien, so utterly beyond his comprehension, that it shattered the very foundations of his faith. What could possibly await him in this strange new reality? The landscape that unfolded before Reynolds defied earthly description. Instead of clouds and harps, he found himself surrounded by intricate, ever-shifting geometries that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Colors he had never seen before danced and intertwined, creating patterns that spoke of a higher order of existence. The very fabric of this place seemed alive, responsive to his thoughts and emotions in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. A.S. Reynolds tried to make sense of his surroundings. A profound confusion washed over him. Where were the familiar images of heaven he had so confidently described to his congregation? The absence of these expected sights filled him with a deep unease. Had he been wrong all along? The possibility shook him to his core, challenging everything he thought he knew about the afterlife. In this otherworldly expanse, Reynolds began to discern what seemed to be structures, though unlike any architecture he had ever encountered. They appeared to be composed of pure energy, constantly shifting and reforming, as if adapting to some cosmic rhythm. Amidst these structures, he perceived beings, entities of light and consciousness that moved with grace and purpose. These beings seemed to communicate without words, exchanging thoughts and emotions in a symphony of silent understanding. As Reynolds observed this strange new world, he recalled stories he had heard of near-death experiences. The feelings of peace and the presence of light were common elements in many accounts. Yet, what he was experiencing went far beyond these simple descriptions. The complexity and alien nature of this realm suggested a reality far more intricate and mysterious than any earthly religion had ever postulated. Suddenly, Reynolds sensed a shift in the energy around him. A powerful presence approached, unlike anything he had ever encountered. The very essence of this realm seemed to part, making way for something truly extraordinary. Reynolds felt a mixture of awe and trepidation as he realized he was about to come face to face with a being of immense significance. As the presence drew near, Reynolds found himself bathed in a light that defied description. It was not merely a visual phenomenon, but a multidimensional experience that engaged every aspect of his being. This being of light radiated wisdom, compassion, and a love so profound it brought Reynolds to the brink of overwhelm. In that moment, he understood that he stood on the precipice of a revelation that would forever alter his understanding of existence. The being of light began to communicate, not through words, but through a direct transmission of thought and emotion. Reynolds braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would challenge everything he had ever believed about the nature of spirituality and the universe itself. "Prepare yourself," the being seemed to say, "for what you are about to learn will rewrite the very fabric of your reality." Reynolds steeled himself, unaware that he was about to glimpse a spiritual landscape so vast and complex it would make his lifelong teaching seem like nursery rhymes. The being of light began to unveil truths that defied Reynolds' understanding. It spoke of spiritual hierarchies that extended far beyond the simplistic notions of heaven and hell. These were not mere levels of afterlife, but intricate, interconnected realms of consciousness that operated on principles beyond human comprehension. Reynolds struggled to grasp the concept, his mind reeling as he tried to reconcile this new information with the beliefs he had held dear for so long. As the revelations continued, Reynolds began to understand that consciousness itself was not bound by linear time as he had always believed. The being showed him how past, present, and future existed simultaneously in this higher realm. Every moment, every decision, every possibility unfolded in a cosmic tapestry of infinite complexity. This understanding shook Reynolds to his core, challenging everything he thought he knew about free will and divine plan. The being then guided Reynolds to perceive the profound interconnectedness of all spiritual existence. He saw how every soul, every spark of consciousness, was inextricably linked in a vast network of energy and information. This web of connection transcended religious boundaries, cultural differences, and even the divide between the physical and spiritual worlds. Reynolds felt overwhelmed by the beauty and complexity of this cosmic design. Realizing how limited his previous understanding had been, Reynolds grappled with these mind-bending concepts. The being prepared to show him something even more profound. There was an air of anticipation, a sense that he was about to receive a truth of immense significance. The light around them seemed to intensify, focusing Reynolds' attention on what was to come. In a moment of pure clarity, Reynolds discovered the universal principle that underpinned all of existence: compassion. Not the limited human understanding of compassion, but a cosmic force of unconditional love and empathy that permeated every level of reality. This revelation struck him with the force of a spiritual thunderbolt, illuminating the true purpose of existence in a way he had never before imagined. As the vision faded, Reynolds found himself grappling with the implications of what he had learned. The neat, orderly theology he had preached for decades now seemed woefully inadequate in the face of this vast, mysterious reality. He realized that his role as a spiritual leader would never be the same. How could he possibly convey the depth and complexity of what he had experienced to his congregation? The weight of this new knowledge pressed upon him, both a blessing and a burden. Reynolds stood at the precipice of a spiritual abyss, his mind reeling from forbidden knowledge. But the being of light wasn't finished. "There's one more truth," it whispered, "that will change everything you thought you knew about your role on Earth." As the full weight of his revelations settled upon him, Reynolds felt a profound sense of overwhelm. The vast, intricate tapestry of spiritual reality he had glimpsed was far beyond the scope of human comprehension. His decades of theological study and preaching suddenly seemed like child's play in comparison to the cosmic truths he had witnessed. The pastor's mind raced, grappling with the limitations of human religious understanding. How could he have been so certain, so unwavering in his beliefs, when the true nature of existence was so much more complex? The neat, orderly theology he had taught for years now felt woefully inadequate, like trying to explain the intricacies of quantum physics with finger paintings. Reynolds struggled to process this new reality. A deep sense of doubt crept in. What was his role as a religious leader now? How could he stand before his congregation and preach about heaven and hell when he had seen firsthand that the spiritual realm defied such simple categorizations? The very foundation of his life's work seemed to crumble beneath him. The emotional turmoil of having his core beliefs challenged was intense. Reynolds experienced a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, awe at the beauty and complexity of what he had witnessed, fear of the unknown implications, and a deep sense of humility in the face of such vast cosmic knowledge. He felt both enlightened and utterly lost, standing at the crossroads of everything he had ever known and an entirely new understanding of reality. This internal struggle mirrored what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a state of mental discomfort experienced when a person simultaneously holds two or more contradictory beliefs or values. In religious contexts, this phenomenon can be particularly intense, as deeply held faith collides with new information that challenges those beliefs. Reynolds was experiencing this dissonance on a cosmic scale, his entire worldview being reshaped in real time. Reynolds grappled with these earth-shattering revelations. The being of light began to prepare him for his return. There was a shift in the energy surrounding them, a sense that their time together was drawing to a close. Yet even in these final moments, the being imparted one last crucial insight. In a flash of understanding, Reynolds gained a profound new perspective on spirituality. He saw that the true essence of faith lay not in rigid doctrines or institutional teachings, but in the individual spiritual journey of each soul. This realization was both liberating and daunting. It meant that his role as a spiritual leader would need to evolve, focusing less on dictating beliefs and more on guiding others to discover their own truths. As this final revelation settled into his consciousness, Reynolds felt an unmistakable pull towards his physical body. The luminous realm around him began to fade, the presence of the being of light growing dimmer. He was being called back to the earthly plane, back to a life forever changed by what he had experienced beyond the veil. The luminous realm faded, and suddenly, Reynolds found himself thrust back into a stark reality. But what happened in those crucial moments between two worlds? The shocking truth of his return would leave even seasoned medical professionals questioning everything they thought they knew about life and death. Pastor Michael Reynolds gasped, his eyes flying open as he jolted back to consciousness. The medical team surrounding him recoiled in shock, their faces a mixture of disbelief and amazement. For several long minutes, Reynolds had shown no signs of life. His heart had stopped beating, his lungs had ceased to draw breath. By all medical standards, he had been clinically dead. Reynolds struggled to regain his bearings. He found himself overwhelmed by a cacophony of sensations. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room seared his retinas, while the incessant beeping of medical equipment assaulted his ears. His body felt heavy and foreign, as if he were inhabiting it for the first time. The stark contrast between the ethereal realm he had just left and the cold, clinical environment of the hospital was jarring. Attempts to communicate his extraordinary experience proved frustratingly difficult. Reynolds' throat felt raw and constricted, his words coming out as little more than unintelligible croaks. The medical staff, still reeling from his unexpected revival, busied themselves with checking his vital signs and stabilizing his condition. Their focus on his physical state left little room for understanding the profound spiritual journey he had just undergone. The initial shock of his return began to subside. Reynolds became acutely aware of the physical and emotional aftermath of his near-death experience. His chest ached from the forceful compressions of CPR, and his body trembled with a mixture of exhaustion and residual adrenaline. Emotionally, he felt both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. The weight of the knowledge he had gained pressed upon him, demanding to be shared even as he struggled to process it himself. The medical team, once they had assured themselves of Reynolds' stability, began to discuss the remarkable nature of his recovery. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the incredibly low survival rates for cases of prolonged cardiac arrest outside of a hospital setting. Reynolds' revival defied their expectations and challenged their understanding of the boundaries between life and death. As he lay there, surrounded by the buzz of medical activity, Reynolds felt a growing certainty that he could not keep his experience to himself. The truths he had glimpsed beyond the veil were too profound, too important to be silenced. He realized with a mixture of determination and trepidation that he must share what he had learned, Even knowing that doing so could cost him everything he had built in his life as a respected pastor, the decision to speak out crystallized in Reynolds' mind, bringing with it a sense of both purpose and apprehension. He knew that his words would challenge the very foundations of the faith he had preached for decades. His congregation, his colleagues, perhaps even his family might struggle to accept the radical new perspective he now possessed. Yet, the importance of sharing this newfound understanding outweighed the potential personal cost that A.S. Reynolds drifted into an exhausted sleep. News of his miraculous recovery began to spread beyond the confines of the hospital. Little did the world know that this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge long-held beliefs and spark a profound reevaluation of the nature of spirituality and existence itself. In the quiet of his hospital room, Pastor Reynolds sat propped up against a mound of pillows, his mind a whirlwind of profound revelations and lingering questions. The weight of his newfound knowledge pressed upon him like an invisible force. What happens when a man of God learns truths that could shatter the very foundations of faith he's sworn to uphold? With trembling hands, Reynolds reached for a notepad and pen on the bedside table. He hesitated for a moment, the blank page before him as daunting as the task ahead. How could he possibly capture the vastness of what he had experienced in mere words? As he began to write, each sentence felt woefully inadequate, a pale shadow of the cosmic truths he had glimpsed beyond the veil. As the words flowed onto the page, a sobering realization washed over him. Sharing this experience could very well mark the end of his career as a pastor. The radical nature of his revelation stood in stark contrast to the established doctrines he had preached for decades. He could already imagine the looks of disbelief, the whispers of heresy that might ripple through his congregation. The community that had been his spiritual family for so long might soon view him as a stranger, or worse, a traitor to their shared faith. Reynolds found himself grappling with an ethical dilemma of immense proportions. On one side stood the comfort of established beliefs, the security of his position, and the trust of his flock. On the other, a truth so profound and transformative that it demanded to be shared. The choice before him was clear, yet agonizingly difficult. Could he, in good conscience, continue to preach a limited understanding of spirituality when he had glimpsed a reality so much vaster and more complex? As he wrestled with these thoughts, Reynolds couldn't help but reflect on the role of doubt in spiritual growth. His entire experience challenged the notion of unwavering, unquestioning faith. Perhaps, he mused, true spiritual evolution required a willingness to question, to explore, and to embrace uncertainty. This realization both terrified and exhilarated him. The soft click of the door opening interrupted his contemplation. Reynolds looked up to see his wife, Sarah, entering the room. Her face, lined with worry and relief, softened as their eyes met. Yet, as she drew closer, a flicker of concern crossed her features. She sensed, with the intuition born of decades of marriage, that something fundamental had changed in her husband. "Michael," she said softly, taking his hand. "What is it? What's happened to you?" Reynolds looked into the eyes of the woman who had stood by him through every trial and triumph of his ministry. In that moment, he knew she would be the first to hear the truth that would reshape their lives. With a deep breath, he began to share his extraordinary journey, watching as wonder, disbelief, and finally understanding dawned on Sarah's face. A.S. Reynolds recounted his experience. He felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This conversation marked the beginning of a new journey, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, spirituality, and the nature of existence itself. Little did they know that beyond the walls of the hospital room, word of Reynolds' miraculous recovery and rumors of his changed perspective had already begun to spread, setting the stage for a revelation that would ripple through their community and beyond. As whispers of Pastor Reynolds' transformation spread like wildfire, an unprecedented scenario unfolded within his once familiar church. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of faith, loyalty, and the human capacity for change. Reynolds stood before his congregation, his hands gripping the pulpit to steady his trembling fingers. The familiar faces looked up at him, a mix of concern and curiosity etched across their features. Taking a deep breath, he began to share his near-death experience, and the profound truths he had encountered beyond the veil. Reynolds spoke of complex spiritual hierarchies and a compassion that transcended religious boundaries. A palpable tension filled the air. Some leaned forward, captivated by his words, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The pastor's voice grew stronger as he described the vastness of the spiritual realm he had glimpsed, his words painting a picture far removed from the simple heaven he had preached about for decades. The reactions from his flock were as diverse as they were intense. Gasps of shock echoed through the church as Reynolds challenged long-held beliefs. Tears streamed down the faces of some, moved by the profound beauty of his experience. Others sat stone-faced, their expressions a mix of disbelief and growing anger. As the service ended, the church erupted into a cacophony of voices. Small groups formed, engaged in heated discussions. Longtime friends found themselves on opposite sides of a theological divide that had opened up in a matter of minutes. The elders of the church huddled together, their faces grave as they contemplated the implications of their pastor's revelation. Sociologists have long studied how religious communities handle challenges to established doctrine. In moments like these, the very fabric of a congregation can be tested. Some members may experience a crisis of faith, while others might find their beliefs strengthened or transformed. The social bonds that once held the community together can fray under the strain of conflicting interpretations. As days passed, news of Reynolds' extraordinary claims spread beyond the confines of his church. Local media picked up the story, and soon, religious leaders from other denominations began to weigh in. Some dismissed Reynolds' experience as a hallucination or a misguided interpretation. Others saw it as a potential threat to established religious order. Reynolds found himself facing potential backlash from religious institutions that viewed his revelations as dangerous heresy. Calls for his resignation began to circulate, and he received stern warnings from his superiors within the church hierarchy. The pastor who had once been a pillar of traditional faith now found himself cast as a controversial figure, challenging the very foundations of organized religion. Reynolds grappled with the consequences of sharing his truth. An unexpected letter arrived at his office. The envelope bore the seal of a prestigious interfaith organization, inviting him to speak at an upcoming conference. It seemed that his journey of revelation was far from over, and a new chapter was about to begin. As Reynolds took the stage at the Interfaith Conference, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. The audience, comprised of religious leaders from diverse backgrounds, leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear from this unlikely speaker. Reynolds, once a pillar of traditional Christian faith, now stood before them as a man transformed by an extraordinary experience that challenged the very foundations of organized religion. With a deep breath, Reynolds began to share his near-death journey. He spoke of the luminous realm he had encountered, describing complex spiritual hierarchies and a universal compassion that transcended religious boundaries. As his words filled the auditorium, a spectrum of reactions rippled through the crowd. Some listeners nodded in rapt attention, their eyes wide with wonder. Others furrowed their brows, skepticism etched across their faces. A Sikh leader in the front row listened intently, drawing parallels between Reynolds' account and the concept of Sachkhand, the realm of truth in Sikh philosophy. Nearby, a Buddhist monk closed his eyes, deep in contemplation, as Reynolds' description of interconnected consciousness resonated with teachings of interdependence and non-duality. Reynolds delved into the profound compassion he had experienced. A Muslim scholar's expression softened, reminded of the merciful nature of Allah described in Islamic teachings. Even a Hindu Swami, initially skeptical, found himself intrigued by the parallels between Reynolds' vision of multiple spiritual realms and the concept of lokas. In Hindu cosmology, the pastor's revelation seemed to transcend religious boundaries, touching on universal themes that resonated across faith traditions. His account of a reality beyond simple notions of heaven and hell challenged not just Christian doctrine, but prompted reflection among leaders of various beliefs. Reynolds' talk neared its conclusion. Tension mounted in the auditorium. A prominent skeptic, known for his vocal criticism of religious experiences, shifted in his seat. The man's face was a mask of contained disagreement, his hand raised to pose what would undoubtedly be a challenging question. Just as the skeptic opened his mouth to speak, something remarkable occurred. A respected Jewish rabbi stood up, his voice carrying across the hall. "My friends," he began, "while we may not all agree on the specifics of Pastor Reynolds' experience, can we not see the profound truth it points to? The interconnectedness of all beings, the power of compassion. These are principles that unite our diverse faiths." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Reynolds' account, rather than dividing the assembly, had unexpectedly served as a bridge between different religious perspectives. The skeptic slowly lowered his hand, his expression softening as he observed the unifying effect of Reynolds' words that as the conference drew to a close. Reynolds found himself surrounded by religious leaders eager to continue the conversation. He had gained unexpected allies in his spiritual journey, opening doors to interfaith dialogue that he never could have imagined in his previous life as a traditional pastor. While religious leaders found common ground in Reynolds' account, a more formidable audience awaited. In a sterile laboratory, a team of consciousness researchers prepared to put his extraordinary claims to the test. What they discovered would send shockwaves through both scientific and spiritual communities. Pastor Reynolds sat motionless in a high-back chair, his scalp dotted with electrodes. The quiet hum of sophisticated machinery filled the air as Dr. Sarah Chun, a renowned neuroscientist, adjusted the settings on a bank of monitors. Alongside her, Dr. James Harper, a physicist specializing in quantum consciousness, studied the initial readings with intense focus. The team had assembled to investigate Reynolds' near-death experience using cutting-edge technology. Their goal was to subject his account to rigorous scientific scrutiny, searching for empirical evidence that could validate or refute his claims. The tension between Reynolds' profound spiritual journey and the researchers' scientific skepticism was palpable. As the test began, Reynolds found himself undergoing a battery of examinations. Advanced brain imaging techniques mapped his neural activity as he recalled his experience. Quantum sensors measured subtle energy fluctuations around his body. Psychological evaluations probed the depths of his psyche, searching for any signs of delusion or fabrication. Dr. Chun explained the process to Reynolds. "We're using functional MRI to observe your brain activity in real time as you recount your experience. This will allow us to identify which areas of your brain activate during specific memories." She paused, her eyes meeting Reynolds. "We're also employing quantum entanglement sensors to detect any anomalous energy patterns that might correlate with your account." The researchers incorporated the latest findings in consciousness studies, drawing parallels between Reynolds' experience and documented cases of heightened awareness during clinical death. They referenced studies on the persistence of consciousness after cardiac arrest and the phenomenon of shared death experiences. As days of testing turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the lab grew electric with anticipation. The team huddled around their data, analyzing every detail with meticulous care. Reynolds waited anxiously, knowing that their findings could either validate his transformative journey or cast doubt on the very foundation of his new understanding. Finally, Dr. Harper approached Reynolds with a mix of excitement and bewilderment. "Pastor," he began, his voice measured, "our findings are remarkable. While we can't conclusively prove every aspect of your experience, we've found compelling evidence that supports key elements of your account." The implications of these findings rippled through academic circles like a stone cast in a still water. Conferences were hastily organized, papers were drafted, and heated debates erupted in prestigious journals. Reynolds' experience, now partially validated by scientific inquiry, challenged long-held beliefs about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries between life and death. Imagine standing before your community, tasked with explaining the unexplainable. This was Pastor Reynolds' reality as he stepped back into his church, forever changed. But as he looked out at familiar faces, a startling realization dawned. His near-death experience hadn't just transformed his faith. It was about to challenge the very foundations of spiritual belief for countless others. Reynolds took a deep breath, his hands resting lightly on the worn wood of the pulpit. The words he was about to speak felt foreign on his tongue, yet truer than any sermon he had ever given. He began to weave his newfound understanding into the fabric of his teachings, carefully bridging the gap between traditional doctrine and the vast, interconnected spiritual reality he had witnessed. As he spoke, Reynolds could sense the mixture of awe and unease rippling through the congregation. He touched on concepts of personal spiritual journeys, emphasizing the unique path each soul must travel. The pastor's voice grew stronger as he described a compassion that transcended religious boundaries, a force so powerful it redefined the very nature of divine love. But with each revelation, Reynolds faced the delicate challenge of balancing his expanded perspective with the comfort of familiar beliefs. He watched as some listeners leaned forward, eyes wide with wonder, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension in the room was palpable, a testament to the profound impact of his words. As weeks passed, Reynolds' sermons evolved, incorporating deeper explorations of personal revelation and spiritual growth. He drew parallels between his experience and the concept of theosis in Eastern Orthodox theology, the idea of humans participating in the divine nature. His teachings began to attract seekers from diverse faith backgrounds, all drawn to the universal truths he now shared. Word of Reynolds' transformed ministry spread quickly, capturing the attention of religious leaders across the nation. One morning, as he sat in his study contemplating the journey ahead, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the National Council of Churches. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope to find an invitation to address the council's annual gathering. The significance of this moment was not lost on Reynolds. He understood that standing before this esteemed body would thrust his message onto a national stage, potentially redefining the concept of spiritual truth for countless believers. As he prepared for this momentous opportunity, Reynolds reflected on the profound responsibility he now carried. His experience had shattered the boundaries of traditional faith, offering a glimpse into a reality far more vast and intricate than he had ever imagined. Now, as he stood poised to share this vision with a broader audience, Reynolds felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He knew that his words had the power to challenge long-held beliefs, spark controversy, and potentially reshape the spiritual landscape of an entire nation. As Pastor Reynolds began to craft his address for the council, he couldn't help but marvel at the extraordinary journey that had led him to this point. From a near-death experience that defied explanation to a transformed ministry that touched countless lives, he stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his spiritual calling. The path ahead was uncertain, but Reynolds felt a deep sense of purpose guiding his every step. The ripple effect of Pastor Reynolds' near-death experience spread far beyond his small-town church, touching lives across the nation. In coffee shops, living rooms, and community centers, people from all walks of life found themselves grappling with the implications of his extraordinary account. Sarah, a young college student, sat in her dorm room, her eyes glued to a viral video of Reynolds sharing his story. She had always considered herself an atheist, but something about the pastor's sincerity and the profound nature of his experience stirred a curiosity she couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself questioning her beliefs about consciousness and the possibility of life after death. Meanwhile, in a bustling city hospital, Dr. James Chun, a renowned neurosurgeon, pored over the scientific data from Reynolds' case. The empirical evidence supporting aspects of the pastor's account challenged everything Dr. Chun thought he knew about the brain and consciousness. He couldn't help but wonder if there was more to human existence than what could be measured in a laboratory. Across the country, heated debates erupted in religious communities. Traditional believers found themselves at odds with those who embraced Reynolds' expanded spiritual perspective. In one particularly tense church meeting, longtime friends Martha and John argued passionately about the nature of heaven and the afterlife. Their disagreement highlighted the growing divide between those clinging to established doctrines and those open to new interpretations. The conversation sparked by Reynolds' revelation extended far beyond religious circles. Sociologists and cultural anthropologists noted a significant shift in spiritual trends. Recent surveys showed a marked increase in people identifying as spiritual but not religious, with many citing Reynolds' story as a catalyst for their changing beliefs. As Reynolds' influence grew, so did the anticipation surrounding his next moves. Rumors circulated about a potential book deal and speaking tour. Some speculated that he might establish a new spiritual movement, while others wondered if he would retreat from the public eye to focus on personal growth and reflection. The profound impact of Reynolds' transformation was perhaps best exemplified by Lisa, a middle-aged woman battling terminal cancer. After hearing the pastor's account, she found a renewed sense of peace and purpose in her final days. Lisa's family marveled at the change in her outlook, grateful for the comfort Reynolds' story had brought her. As the dust began to settle, Pastor Reynolds found himself reflecting on his unexpected role as a spiritual pioneer. He sat in his study, surrounded by letters from people whose lives had been touched by his experience. The weight of responsibility was immense, but so was the sense of purpose that filled him. Reynolds knew that his journey was far from over. As he gazed out the window at the setting sun, he couldn't help but wonder what new revelations awaited him on the horizon of his evolving spiritual understanding. Reynolds sat in his study, eyes closed in deep meditation. The morning sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on his face. His journey of spiritual discovery, far from reaching its conclusion, continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Each day brought new revelations, challenging his understanding of the vast spiritual landscape he had glimpsed during his near-death experience. As he delved deeper into his meditation practice, Reynolds found himself grappling with concepts that defied easy explanation. The boundaries between individual consciousness and the universal field of awareness seemed to blur, revealing interconnections he had never before imagined. He realized that spiritual growth was not a linear path, but a spiraling journey of continuous expansion and deepening understanding. The pastor's explorations led him to contemplate the nature of spiritual truth itself. He came to see that human understanding, limited by the constraints of physical existence, could only grasp fragments of a much larger reality. Reynolds pondered the paradox of trying to convey infinite truths through finite language and concepts. How could he share these profound insights with others when words seemed so inadequate to capture the essence of his experiences? As Reynolds prepared to share his latest revelations with his congregation, he felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He knew that each new insight had the potential to challenge not only his followers' beliefs, but also his own. The vastness of spiritual reality continued to unfold before him, revealing layer upon layer of complexity and wonder. In his upcoming sermon, Reynolds planned to emphasize the dynamic nature of spiritual understanding. He would encourage his listeners to embrace uncertainty and remain open to new revelations. The pastor's message had evolved, moving beyond rigid doctrines to celebrate the endless possibilities of spiritual exploration. Reynolds opened his eyes, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the world beyond. The future stretched before him, filled with new challenges and discoveries. He knew that his journey was far from over, and each step would bring him closer to a deeper understanding of the infinite mysteries that lay at the heart of existence. As he prepared to face his congregation once again, Reynolds felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path that had led him to this moment. He was ready to guide others on their own journeys of spiritual discovery, knowing that each individual's path would be unique and filled with its own revelations. The pastor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility and the exhilaration of the unknown that awaited him. Pastor Michael Reynolds' extraordinary journey has left an indelible mark on religious understanding, challenging long-held beliefs and inspiring countless individuals to explore the depths of their own spirituality. His near-death experience opened a window into a reality far more vast and complex than traditional doctrines had ever suggested. As Reynolds continues to share his insights, he emphasizes that spiritual discovery is an ongoing process, one that requires openness, humility, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. The ripple effects of Reynolds' revelations extend far beyond his small-town church, sparking conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and places of worship across the nation. His story has become a bridge between science and spirituality, prompting researchers to delve deeper into the mysteries of consciousness and the nature of existence itself. For many, Reynolds' account has provided comfort and hope, offering a glimpse of a compassionate universe that transcends religious boundaries. As we reflect on Pastor Reynolds' transformative experience, we are left with a profound question. How might our understanding of spiritual truth evolve if we approach it with the same openness and curiosity that Reynolds now embodies? Perhaps the greatest lesson from his journey is that the pursuit of spiritual knowledge is not a destination, but an eternal odyssey of growth and discovery.